because it looks like Stephanie White might have another bonehead trick up her sleeve for today's game. I think Stephanie White is already sick.
The Indiana Fever are down, the clock is ticking, and Stephanie White, the woman trusted to make the right call at the right moment, just handed the ball to Kelsey Mitchell instead of Caitlin Clark. Let that sink in for a second. Not in garbage time. Not as some throwaway possession in a game already decided. In a moment that genuinely mattered. Caitlin Clark, the most watched player in WNBA history, the woman who single-handedly broke viewership records and pulled an entire league into the mainstream spotlight, was standing right there on the floor, available, ready. And her own head coach looked the other way. Fever fans did not just notice. They erupted. Social media caught fire within minutes of that possession ending. Clips were already spreading before the final buzzer even sounded. But here is the thing. Before you pick a side, before you decide whether Stephanie White made a catastrophic mistake or a calculated masterstroke, you need to understand exactly what happened in that moment, why she made that call, and what it genuinely reveals about the direction this Fever team is being built in. You are already asking yourself whether this was disrespect or just basketball. Because on the surface, it looks bad. It feels bad. It looks like a coach second-guessing her own star player on the biggest stage possible. But then the next question hits you a little harder than the first one. Does Stephanie White actually trust Caitlin Clark in crunch time situations, or is she still managing her like a developing project rather than treating her like a genuine closer who can win you games? And now you are going even deeper. Is Kelsey Mitchell truly the better option in that specific situation given the matchup and the moment, or is the coaching staff operating off of something that the broadcast cameras simply are not showing us? Then comes the one that really stings if you are a Caitlin Clark fan. If Clark is everything the league has been selling her as, the face of a new era, the reason half of these new viewers even know what the WNBA is, then why is she not the first name being called when the pressure is at its highest? And finally, the question that nobody seems to want to say out loud. Is there a tension quietly building inside that locker room that the highlight reels are not capturing? This video is going to break all of it down, and I genuinely mean all of it. You are going to see the exact play in question, dissect the decision in real time, and walk away with a clear understanding of the tactical reasoning Stephanie White was actually working from in that moment, because context changes everything. Then we are going to zoom out and look at how frequently Clark is being used as a primary option versus being positioned as a secondary weapon, because the broader pattern across this season is far more revealing than any single possession ever could be. And then we are going to talk about what this specific moment means for the identity of this Fever team going forward, because this was not just a coaching decision made in the heat of a game. Whether Stephanie White intended it or not, it was a statement. A signal. And signals like that have a way of defining a season before it is even halfway finished. But before we dive into all of that, do you think Caitlin Clark should be the non-negotiable first option in every late-game situation, regardless of matchup, or do you believe the context and the defense should always determine who gets the ball? Let me know in the comments below. The return to Connecticut was never going to be just another road game on the schedule. This was the building where Caitlin Clark's entire season collapsed last year. The last arena she stepped into before a groin injury sent her home and kept her there for the remainder of the season. The Fever never saw her again after that night. So walking back into that gym carries a weight that goes far beyond the standings. But the emotional backdrop of this game is actually the least interesting part of what you need to focus on right now. The commentary around Stephanie White refusing to publicly credit Clark after a 30-point double-double is not a small detail you should scroll past. That is a coaching culture red flag sitting in plain sight. You do not minimize your franchise player's best performance of the season in a locker room setting and expect that to have no consequences on trust, on chemistry, or on the dynamic between coach and player. And then layered directly on top of that comes the prediction that White is about to hand the ball back to Kelsey Mitchell in a moment that should have Clark's name written all over it. That combination of patterns is not random. That is a philosophy revealing itself.
Stephanie White making her return to Connecticut to take on the Connecticut Sun. This is also going to be a big game for Caitlin Clark. Obviously, this is where Caitlin Clark's season ended last season with that groin injury and everything that was going on. This was the last gym we saw her play in last season, and we never saw her again. So this is going to be a big moment and a big game for not only Stephanie White, but Caitlin Clark as well. Now, I believe Stephanie White's about to make a boneheaded decision. Stephanie White was spotted refusing to credit Caitlin Clark for a monster 30-point double-double in the locker room. For some reason, Aaliyah Boston, yes, congrats to Aaliyah. She had a career high. She was the only one with a 30-point double-double in Stephanie White's mind. I believe Stephanie, the bonehead White, is about to make a move to put the ball back in Kelsey Mitchell's hand. You got to understand, this lady, she's not comfortable with Caitlin Clark running around, freelancing, doing her thing, using a brush to paint that picture. She's not comfortable with that. This lady naturally wants to control the game from the sideline. She wants to play this slow.
You are probably sitting there right now asking yourself whether Stephanie White genuinely avoided giving Clark her flowers after a 30-point double-double performance. Because if that is confirmed, then this is not a storyline anymore. It is a problem. Then, the next question starts pulling at you a little harder. Why does a head coach feel more comfortable routing the offense through Kelsey Mitchell when Clark is standing right there producing at an elite-level game after game? And then something shifts in how you are thinking about it, because you start wondering whether this is even about basketball logic at all, or whether it is a power dynamic quietly playing out between a coach trying to cement her authority and a player whose star power already exceeds the building she plays in. Then the question that actually stings lands on you. Is Stephanie White genuinely constructing a system designed around what makes Clark dangerous, or is she slowly pushing back against the idea that Clark's instincts and freelance creativity should be leading this offense? And underneath all of that sits the one question nobody wants to answer directly. What does this team's ceiling actually look like if the coach and the franchise player are not operating from the same vision? The honest answer is that Stephanie White arrived in Indiana with a coaching identity that was fully formed before Caitlin Clark ever put on a Fever jersey. And that identity is rooted in structure, control, and deliberate half-court execution. That is not a flaw on its own. Plenty of successful coaches operate that way. But what you are watching unfold is a very real tension between a system-minded coach and a generational playmaker who is most dangerous when the reins are loosened and she is allowed to process the game in real time. The locker room situation surrounding Aaliyah Boston's career high, regardless of how it gets framed in press conferences, sends a message that everyone inside that organization can read clearly. Players notice when their biggest performances get minimized. Teammates file that away. And when you stack that on top of a consistent pattern of going back to Mitchell in the moments that matter most, you are no longer looking at isolated decisions. You are looking at a coaching philosophy that has not fully committed to Clark as the unquestioned first option when everything is on the line. That is the real story living underneath this game. And what actually happened once the ball was inbounded takes everything you just processed and raises it to an entirely different level. There is a coaching philosophy argument buried inside this clip, and it is more revealing than it might sound on the surface. The comparison to Luka Doncic is not a throwaway reference. It is actually a precise way of describing how certain coaches view ball-dominant guards who operate outside of a structured system. And the implication is that Stephanie White falls into that category of coaches who are simply not comfortable with that style of play. That part of the analysis is fair and honestly pretty sharp. Where things get even more interesting is the warning about overlooking Connecticut. 2 and 12 sounds harmless on paper. But the Chicago Sky were struggling too, and the Fever nearly dropped that game. The Washington Mystics were in a similar position, and Clark had to personally bail Indiana out. So the record does not always tell the full story, and walking into Connecticut with a relaxed mentality because of their standing in the league would be exactly the kind of mistake that turns a bad coaching decision into a damaging loss.
Caitlin plays does not align with how Stephanie White sees the game, which is why she feels the way she feels about Luka Doncic and other ball-dominant guards. It doesn't tickle her fancy. if you know what I mean. So Stephanie White may be looking to take the ball out of Caitlin Clark's hands today and put it back in Kelsey Mitchell's hands. And we know that's not going to work. This team does not play their best like that. And I'm telling you right now, you look at the schedule, you look at the record, the Connecticut Sun stink. They're 2-12. This team is garbage. You know what? So was the Chicago Sky, and we should have lost to them. So was the Washington Mystics, and without Caitlin Clark bailing you out.
You are probably sitting with this and asking yourself whether Stephanie White's discomfort with ball-dominant guards is actually shaping her in-game decisions more than the actual matchup in front of her is. Because if a coach's personal philosophy is overriding what the numbers and the performances are clearly telling her, that is a serious problem that goes beyond one game. Then you start wondering how many close calls against weaker opponents it is going to take before the Fever coaching staff accepts that this offense runs through Clark, or it does not run at all. And then a quieter question settles in. If Connecticut is sitting at 2-12 and Indiana is still being warned not to overlook them, what does that say about the Fever's consistency when Clark is not carrying the load herself? Then the one that really makes you think, is Kelsey Mitchell being set up to succeed in this system? Or is she being handed a role that quietly exposes the limitations of White's offensive philosophy? Here is what the pattern is actually telling you. Stephanie White is not making these decisions because Kelsey Mitchell gives Indiana a better chance to win. She is making them because handing the offense to Mitchell feels more familiar and more controlled from a sideline perspective. That is a coach prioritizing comfort over results, and in a league where margins are razor thin, that distinction matters enormously. The near losses to Chicago and Washington are not flukes. They are what happens when Clark is not the engine driving everything forward, and Connecticut being 2-12 does not make them a pushover. It makes them dangerous in the specific way that desperate teams always are. They have nothing to lose and everything to prove. The Fever walking in there with a diluted offensive approach centered around Mitchell instead of Clark is not a calculated risk. It is a gamble built on the wrong instincts. And what actually unfolded during this game proves that point in a way that no pregame analysis ever could. The confidence in this prediction is not arrogance. It is actually rooted in something very real. Connecticut at 2-12 is not a roster built to handle the kind of pace and pressure that Caitlin Clark generates when she is fully unleashed. The read and react system, the breakneck tempo, the ability to make decisions before most defenders have even processed the previous one. That is a specific brand of basketball that teams without elite athleticism and communication simply cannot keep up with for 40 minutes. That part of the argument is completely sound. Where you have to pump the brakes slightly is the certainty that this game ends before the fourth quarter. That assumes Stephanie White actually allows Clark to dictate the pace from the opening tip, which based on everything you have already seen in this video, is far from guaranteed. The real question this clip plants in your mind is not whether Clark can blow Connecticut out. It is whether she will ever be given the freedom to try.
Out of the way, the Indiana Fever, led by Caitlin "the Reason" Clark, will blow the doors off the Connecticut Sun, and this game will be over before the fourth quarter. This game will be over before the fourth quarter if they play CC style and allow her to run the show and be that dominant player that we've seen, that we know she can be. The Connecticut Sun have no answer. They don't have nearly enough firepower to get up and down with that breakneck CC speed of basketball, that read and react system. The Connecticut Sun don't have nearly enough talent to compete with it. It's that simple. That's the number one key to this game. Allowing Caitlin Clark to run the show all 40 minutes. Allow Caitlin Clark to dominate this game from start to finish, and the game will be finished before the fourth quarter, and everybody can kick their feet up.
You are probably nodding along and then immediately catching yourself because the logic makes complete sense on paper, but something about it feels fragile. If Clark running the show for 40 minutes is genuinely the key to making this game uncompetitive by the fourth quarter, then why does it keep feeling like that decision is not fully in Clark's hands? Then you start wondering whether Stephanie White has ever actually watched what happens to opposing defenses when Clark operates in that read and react mode for extended stretches, because the film is not subtle about what it reveals. And then a more uncomfortable question surfaces. If the blueprint for beating a 2-12 team is this straightforward, what does it say about Indiana's recent close calls that the blueprint keeps getting ignored? Then the one that quietly reframes everything. Is Clark being coached, or is she being managed? Because those two things produce very different results on the floor. The honest take is that this prediction represents the best version of what Indiana is capable of, and the frustrating part is that this best version is entirely accessible. Connecticut does not have the defensive personnel to stay in front of Clark in the open floor. They do not have the communication speed to handle her off-ball movement in a flowing offense. The talent gap is real and significant. But talent gaps only get exposed when the coach in charge is willing to weaponize them. And everything you have watched in this video points to a head coach who keeps reaching for the safer, slower, more controlled approach even when the aggressive one is sitting right there begging to be used. The gap between what Indiana could be and what Stephanie White is allowing them to be is growing more visible with every possession. And what actually happened when the ball was put in motion tells you exactly how wide that gap has become. What you have just watched is not a storyline about one play or one possession. It is a coaching philosophy slowly revealing its ceiling. And that ceiling is lower than this roster deserves. Stephanie White has the most watchable, most impactful player in the modern WNBA running her offense. And she keeps choosing control over explosion at the exact moments when explosion wins games. The talent gap between Indiana and their opponents is real. The question was never whether Clark could close it. The question was whether her own coach would let her. If you want to stay ahead of every development inside this fever season, as the tension between philosophy and potential keeps building, subscribe now, because this story is nowhere near its final chapter.